If you try to optimize to win at every single part of your life, you will necessarily have worse global outcomes over your life.
Just this year, things started to happen, and I have no idea why. I didn't change anything, so I'm completely divorced from it. It's like I was doing it, nothing happened, I'm doing it, things are happening, I'll keep doing it, things will stop happening again.
And then you ask yourself, if I keep living this way, will I be satisfied with the results? I think that that's important. And then, of course, you ask this question, will I be satisfied if I keep living this way and I die next month? And will I be satisfied if I keep living this way with the results if I die in 100 years?
He says basically all literature and good storytelling is secrets. So it's the slow revelation, withholding, and perhaps foreshadowing of secrets.
I don't believe that you can win at life if you try to optimize every single part in a vacuum.
Hey, you're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Zeigler, and on each episode, I invite not one, but two guests to join me for a conversation-style interview. These are smart, funny, usually a little eccentric, frequently a little weird, often very online friends of mine, and even if you don't understand what they have in common at first, just wait, because I've seen some common ground between them that I've been dying to ask them about, and just press record. The show practically named itself, seriously. So subscribe, like, comment below, and stick around at the end of the disclosures, disclaimers, and reminders, and, come find me, cultishcreative.com, at cultishcreative on Twitter, and by name on LinkedIn. Without further ado, throw your seatbelts on. Let's make it a record. Okay, I am pressing record now. You're watching Just Press Record right here on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Zeigler. These two guests, now they know of each other, but they've never actually met each other, which is so exciting because I love both of their work. Let me introduce them. I'm going to introduce them to each other and to you just for this. My first guest. Now, when I think of my favorite Dylans, my most favorite Dylans, first to come to mind, probably Bob Dylan, lots of songs, but I'm thinking of this quote today. I accept chaos, but I'm not sure whether it accepts me. And then I think of Dylan Thomas, the poet, and not the extra stellar rage against the dying of the light quote, but my tears are like the quiet drift of unremembered skies and snows. Oh man, and then I go to Dylan Thomas, the actor in Rumblefish, and really this quote comes from his father, Dennis Hooper, and I'll explain the through line maybe later. No, your mother is not crazy, and neither, contrary to popular belief, is your crazy brother. He's merely miscast in a play. He was born in the wrong era, on the wrong side of the river, with the ability to be able to do anything that he wants and to do, finding nothing that he wants to do. I mean nothing. Now, what does a person who can do anything but can't find nothing he wants to do have in common with the poetry of tears like the quiet drift of unremembered skies and snow and the idea of accepting chaos but not knowing it accepts you back? This is my way of saying this Dylan puts as much optimistically existential crises into my Twitter timeline as I normally have on the feed inside of my own brain behind my eyeballs, and I love him for it. So if Dostoevsky had an OnlyFans, he would clearly be the face of it. Dylan O'Sullivan, welcome to the show.
10 out of 10. You've given me a business idea now, though. So I may have to mull on that.
I want to see if that business idea can come to fruition. You might even get me to OnlyFans. Now, this next guest, we know Rene Descartes once famously said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Cogito, I think. Ergo, therefore, sum, I am. It's been a long time since 7th grade Latin, but I think that's the way that runs. But this guest, he's more cogito ergodicity David Hume. Cogito, I think, ergodicity, much of life is Russian roulette. No, what you see is never all there is. No, a system can work well on average and still fail locally. Okay, we're getting close. Ergodicity is this idea that your life is never average, even if life in average is average, and that takes us all the way to David Hume, who said, you can't derive an is from an ought. And nobody I know is better to explain all of this flavor of existential crisis, which I also regularly have, then please look my lack of ability to produce my original idea of Nassim Taleb in a Darth Vader costume telling this guest, Luca, I am your father. I'm going to see if I can get to that. But this is the author of Ergodicity himself, along with How to Play and Win Long-Term Games, 100 Truths You Will Learn Too Late, which I also love. Luca Dellanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Matt. And nice to meet you, Dylan.
You too, Luca. Let's hope we're not bitter enemies by the end of this now, because it could go either way, you know.
It could go
Why
either
would
way.
we?
So let's start with this. Let's make everybody as uncomfortable as I already have with the introductions. Dylan, if I asked you to define the word ergodicity, could you actually define that word in any way, shape, or form? And Luca, you're not getting off the hook with this.
Well, if you are familiar with me at all, you know I'm a word cell down to the very core. But that
That's
doesn't
why I asked.
extend to mathematical words, it appears, because I have no idea what. I've heard the term, I've heard ergodic, but I have no idea what the word actually means. So we'll have
All
to
right.
turn to our esteemed guest here.
Before we let the esteemed guest answer, Luca, do you have like a running version of existential or existentialism in your head? Do you have a running definition there?
Existentialism. Not much, to be honest. Like, I'm not super big fan of the words that end with ism, because I hear them like in so many contexts that I always yeah. So not so much. I would guess it's about asking important questions.
Well, stick with me for a second, Luca. Give Dylan and give me here a definition of this lovely word and this lovely book. What is ergodicity? What's that word even mean?
So you asked a very trick question, because the whole reason I believe that the book was successful was because I didn't venture into defining the word until half of the book.
I know,
And-
because I had to
and
go
I think
looking to
that's-
figure it out.
Yeah, and I think it's still not a good idea to define it, but like I can give an example. I always use the story of my cousin. He was a skier, very young age, great skier, and then very sadly, one leg injury after another, he had to quit professional skiing since very young. He wasn't even past of age. And from him, I've learned the lesson that performance is subordinate to survival. And I'm not just saying that survival matters to performance, but that it's more important than performance over the long term. And I always make a very short numeric example to drive the point, because people don't believe it until they hear the numbers. Imagine a ski championship consisting of 10 races. And my cousin, very good skier, he wins 20%, he has a 20% chance of winning each race. But he also takes a lot of risks, and he has a 20% chance of breaking his leg in each race. How many races is he expected to win? And the naive answer is 2 races, because we think 10 races, 20%, that makes 2. But if you run the numbers, it's only 0.71. Why? Because if he breaks his leg in the first race, not only he loses that race, but he loses all following races. And these two principles, the principle that when there is irreversibility, losses absorb future gains. So in this case, you break your leg, it's not just what happens in the short term, but also in the long term. And therefore, the fact that when there is irreversibility, you cannot extrapolate averages, that's what I would call non-ergodicity or ergodicity. Yes.
Hold all that in your head for a second, Dylan, and tell me, how would you define existential or existentialism or that body of work?
Yeah, and I'm similar to Luca in the sense I don't like isms. I think, was it Hofstadter said, like, they kind of suggest an atrophy of thought. It's like the things are frozen in place and they're automatically crude in that sense. Again, like I'm not big on the definitions. I'm kind of more of I don't like to label things.
Give me the
Those
feel.
types of things.
Give us the
The
feel.
feel, I would think it would just be placing kind of meditations on the nature of existence at kind of the center of your worldview. So it's kind of a self-centric and introspective, where you dive inward, and it's less concerned with the world. I think even David Foster Wallace talked about it. When you read Dostoevsky, there's no mountains, there's no landscapes, there's nothing physical almost at all. It's all kind of, the interior contents of one's brain, often the darkness of it. But it's kind of the ism is just kind of an obsession with that, I think.
So play with that idea in your head for a second for me, Dylan, because I see this connection between the internal construct of like thinking about a Dostoevsky play and something else, and what Luca just said, this idea of like performance is subordinate to survival. it's a freaking mess out there. Like, how did you think about his definition of ergodicity and how it might relate back to this
I'm
existential way?
always fascinated by this stuff. I'm fascinated by things I don't quite understand because I think it lets my brain kind of fill in interesting gaps. So it's kind of like, that kind of the zone of proximal development. You kind of want to be just out of your comfort zone, but not drowning. So, because I read all Taleb's work, and I even read that like there's a fully quant book. Is it like the statistical long tails or whatever it was? I have no idea what's going on, but I read it anyway because I was like, this stuff just sounds so cool, and I was kind of getting a grasp of 10% of it. So that's how I feel about Luca's definition. I understand it as it's going along, but then if you told me to kind of say it or restate it or expound on it, I couldn't. But I was it's going with the vibe. You know what I mean?
Swimming in it. And Luca, what about you? What about when you think about existential and what Dylan just said? Did any of that hit you in an interesting way?
Yeah, I think that kind of like filled like the idea I had giving it more details. I found interesting like when there was the passage between thinking about existence, like meditations about existence, which in that moment I thought they're very like you are not at the center, like you're thinking about existence in general. I'm thinking like about how big everything is around you, and then Dylan, you switch to self-centered. I think you used the word at some point, and then I was trying to understand like this, like how it is to think about existence while putting yourself at the center. Yeah, that doesn't. Yeah, I was trying to grasp it. Yeah.
Say more about that, Dylan. What do you think he's trying to grasp at? Help explain this to him.
That's interesting because I think there may be something that I said that glossed over something. So again, you look at a lot of literature today, and Taleb calls it the style du jour is emotional hypochondria. So it's kind of just hyper confessional, just very emotional, kind of on the stream of consciousness always. But I suppose then what separates existentialism from something like that is that it pushes through. So you go into the recesses of your mind, but then it asks big questions on the other side. In the same way that you could project outwards, and you could, when you start thinking about stars too much, you start thinking it comes back to you, and you start thinking about the nature of existence within the whole, the universe writ large. And I think existentialism then is just that in the opposite direction. So you're finding the universal through the particular, but it's an inward trajectory.
Luca, how's that shaping the way you're hearing what he's saying?
I think it was very clear. I think I really liked this idea of like reflecting, like of using something else to understand you and of using you to understand something else, and like which probably yields better results than just focusing on one of the two sides only.
So am I on to something in this? Because I think about your cousin, I think about the skiing story, and I think about the existential crisis of choosing to do something like be a skier at a higher level. Because it feels like you have to understand this somehow inside your own brain. You have to kind of reject the reality of failure, but you have to know like what you're doing is crazy. Like, how do I reconcile these two things? Because this is why you're both here helping me think through this today.
That's very interesting because I think that's like one reason why I think like I could not be a great professional athlete. Meaning that like I believe that to become a professional athlete you need to really give it all, and like when you're doing your sport you need to just think about that, and I mean not completely ignore risks, but to some degree ignore the risks which are not particularly relevant in a way. Whereas for me, I'm like the opposite kind of person. Like I always think about risks, not in an hypochondriac way, but it's just always there thinking about and seeing all the parts of my life as a whole. Like I never, for example, optimize work or optimize personal life. I'm always like thinking, and I think that's just incompatible with being a professional athlete.
Dylan, how compatible are you with being a professional athlete?
Well, I played a lot of sports until I was 21 or so. I played like three or four, kind of all the way through. I found I am someone who gets in their head or in one's own head. And I kind of feel sometimes that, I mean this in a kind of polite way, that an element of not stupidity, but kind of obliviousness sometimes can serve you very well in a particular sport, just because you can be so one-track minded and you're not even entertaining the various downfalls that are kind of surrounding you at all moments, whether it be a physical or even, like a technical mistake within the game itself. And and I love that idea of once you kind of introduce yourself as the observer, then you up the very risks that you're trying to avoid if you kind of overthink about them. And that's why you see like Ronaldo when he's taking a penalty, thought doesn't even cross his mind that he'll miss. It's not even on the table, and hence he rarely does. But I think if you're constantly thinking, wondering, oh God, or what percentage chance do I have of missing that thing, that percentage is going to kind of skyrocket just by the very nature of you being hyper fixating on it. So I'm not compatible, but I love it. But no, it would never have worked.
I think I have a
Skill
whole
issues aside.
skill issues aside. I have a whole separate thread about Ronaldo that I don't know if we'll get to, but I'm putting a pin in this one in my head. Luca, this idea, and I guess this ties to the playing long games and infinite games and all this type of stuff that you write about too. This idea of the element of stupidity required to play a game, and I know we're talking about sports and we're reducing something in a painfully obvious way, hopefully, so not to criticize this, but is there a certain element of when you're playing a game and you're trying to both win in the short term but win in the long term where you almost have to like just put blinders up to it? Do you have to get stupid to succeed?
Well, so first, I prefer the word oblivious than stupid, because like stupid tends to be more negative, whereas oblivious is more like a synonym of focused in a way. That said, like the whole point that I had in winning long-term games is that if you try to optimize to win at every single part of your life, you will necessarily have worse global outcomes over your life. So for example, like if you optimize your career, not optimize in the sense of I try to make a few adjustments which bring good improvement, which of course do it, but optimize as in that's the one metric I will care about for the next 10 years, and I try to maximize that. I think that that's detrimental to the other parts of your life. And so for me, it's much more having, you cannot win, I don't believe that you can win at life if you try to optimize every single part in a vacuum. That's the idea. And you always need instead to consider the whole. And then of course, maybe there is a moment where you think about something. For example, you think just about work, but it's always then you ask yourself if it makes sense in the context of your life. Yeah.
Do you feel like yourself asking those questions, Dylan? You're off on this new venture now. You're shifted from writing to, I'm going to say editing, but feel free to clarify this. Do you feel that changing the nature of how you interact with the game itself and how you think about what risks you're controlling for?
Yeah, not even as much for myself, but I read a lot about writers just because it helps me in work. And there was that Nadal ad the other day. They posted when he retired as greatness. It only takes everything. And then there's that idea that, well, and how do you balance? Do I just try and do what Lucas said, and where you kind of, you try and live a well-rounded life all the way up, or do you say, well, no, I'll be well-rounded in 5 years' time, and I'm just going to be a psycho for the next 5 years, and then try and live more on the other side. So there's this constant kind of temporal trade-off that you're trying to do, because then going back to when you read about writers and you see kind of the names we know them for a reason. It's because they very much put life on the shelf for long periods of time and just focused on nothing but. So then you have to weigh up on a kind of psychological or personal level. Okay, you don't want to do that and for it not to work out, because then you've lost both games. So you have to weigh it up strategically. But then you're going to say, is that something that kind of fits me temperamentally? Even if I was possible, is that worth it? Because, you know, you extrapolate, okay, like Mike Tyson, did you see he was talking about legacy the other day? And he was like, doesn't give a fuck about legacy. I'm going to be dead.
What did you just do? Right.
Yeah. So then you kind of, in the grand scheme, is greatness even worth it? With, you know, death, who knows how far around the corner, to bring it back to existentialism. But yeah, I do think about, less so for myself, but I do think about those questions because I'm surrounded by great writers who've been dead for a long time, and kind of their greatness fascinates me.
What about you, Luca? How do you apply this, just your personal life, your personal approach to your career, the speaking, the teaching, the writing?
I think that I had a big moment of clarity, like a few years ago. I got diagnosed with cancer. Thankfully, very early, like everything got treated clearly and so on. But I remember clearly about the things like in those few hours from when I got the diagnosis to when the doctor told me like, no, actually it's very treatable. So in these like 4 hours where you're thinking like, oh my God, what's going to happen? I remember very clearly what I was thinking about and what I was not thinking about. And I remember that I was thinking about basically my wife, my dog, and my parents, first of all, and then the small things of life. And I was thinking like, oh my God, if the doctor tells me like next week, like how I'm going to spend the next week. And I remember that work was not really in the picture. And so I think that brought some clarity. But then the other consideration is that I was thinking about that with the perspective of like, I don't know, 1 week, 1 month. Life is more complex because in life you don't know which time horizon you can, like maybe you live your life optimizing for 50 years and then you die in 10 years. Or maybe it's the other thing. You live life day after day and then you discover that at 50 years old you cannot find a spouse or you're homeless or whatnot. And so the thing that I'm doing nowadays is that every week I try to do a few things which are optimal as if I died next month, and a few things which are optimal as if I lived until 100 years old. And the key is making sure that none of those things that I do are incompatible with the other time horizon. So for example, I'm not living for next month as in selling my house and going to live in the tropical, for example. Something that's compatible, and I think that's a good alternative to optimizing, like making sure that whatever is the time horizon that life will give me, I will not have many regrets.
How's that hit you, Dylan? How's that feel?
Feel called out.
You're not alone in that. Me too. That was profoundly beautiful, Luca.
Yeah. That's a really powerful way of framing it. And again, it's the incompatibility with those kind of things that doesn't work. So I think that's a very, it's could you give an example? I don't want to put you on the spot, but like, so what is something that is compatible with next month and 10 years? And
well, it's not
how do those things
necessarily
differ?
compatible, but that it's not incompatible.
Yeah.
So for example, if I live for next month by, I don't know, spending a weekend out with my wife, or I don't know, indulging in some small piece of enjoyment without going bankrupt or without like indebting me, that's compatible with the long term. So it's not necessarily optimal, but it's compatible. Same thing, like building for the long term. If I decide to work hard 40 or 50 hours a week, that's compatible with the short term. If I decide to work hard 80 hours a week or 70 hours a week, that would be more incompatible. So that's kind of how I'm reasoning.
Okay, it's like a framework for memento mori as opposed to just remembering the phrase.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Is there anything inside of that, Dylan, with, I mean, a framework for memento mori? When you think about either other authors or people you're curious in or reading about, Do you see anybody actually doing this well? We already gave the Mike Tyson, version, which is bizarre, perhaps, if nothing else. But does anybody come to mind that you're like, wow, they figured this out?
Well, I think I don't know if they had. I don't know if we'd necessarily know about it.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's generally a personal thing.
Are there breadcrumbs of this? Like, in a weird way, is late stage Hemingway trying to do something like this? Like end of the career? Or was he still toppling too much towards death?
Well, he didn't end it particularly efficiently.
We're avoiding that part.
Yeah. I suppose he did taper off. Let me see an example. I can't think of a direct example, but I did read I was reading a Norm Macdonald interview that was published the day he died yesterday. And he was talking about all this because they asked him about Twitter, actually. And he was like, I think it's fundamentally bad for me as a human being. And then they were like, how? And then he starts talking about just how little time he had left. And then he talks about gambling. He says, the thing of gambling, it wasn't the money I lost, it was the time. Which is such a great line.
It's such a great line.
Because we all have our gambling. But then I suppose something so profound that he did it, the fact that he didn't tell anybody, that he knew it was terminal and he knew he was going. So then he didn't let the end of his life kind of be defined by that sense of pity and that sense of, I know what you're thinking, even though we're trying to have a conversation about something else. And he went out on his terms. And you see it breaking through sometimes, that it was his last Letterman. When he says, I love you, and he bursts into tears, and everyone's like, kind of like, wow, he must really love me. But no, it's because he knows he's going to die in probably a matter of months at that point. So I think in terms of like being faced with actual death and then not letting that affect your life, when it wasn't around the corner, like he was right in front of me, knew it was happening. I thought though how he handled that, I think, was so unusual in kind of a attention-seeking culture that we often live in, and I don't want to do like the victim mentality, but like, there is a sense of like with the internet, so much pity and adoration is so freely available if you just say the right thing. It's a very tempting thing to lean into that, and he leant away, and just focus on his family, which I thought was a profound thing to do.
There's this weird crossover of like the external definition and the internal definition, and an awareness of that in playing these games. Luca, any just thought on that? Did you know that Norm Macdonald story? I don't even know. Are you a Norm Macdonald fan?
No, I didn't know about the story. I loved it, and I particularly loved the quote about gambling. That's not the money, the time, which I think it's super relevant. Like, it's like so often we only think about like the financial cost of things, and we don't think either about the time or like the cost in terms of relationships. So that really hit hard. What was the question again? Sorry.
I think the question behind the question was just, you shared this personal story, and this is not me looking for pity for you from the internet by any means, but you got this diagnosis, you had that window of the abject terror of struggling with your mortality, and like the instinct clearly wasn't to, I don't know, go put it on Twitter or something. Like, yeah,
no, actually the fact is that I only shared about it like years later, like once everything was done. So first of all, it was not such a big thing as other diagnoses. Like, it was very early stage, so I absolutely don't want to put me on the level of people who got much worse. But there is also the thing that like, no, immediately like the reflect was just going to my wife and mostly, and me and her, and I wasn't really caring much about anything else.
what is it about that that close confidence of being able to, go to your wife and not need to go to somebody else when there's something with the stakes that high?
I think that simply that like she's definitely the person I care about the most, and I spend most time. And it's a bit me, but in my like hierarchy of relationships, like I don't put my friends at the same level. Like for me, there is clearly my mother, her companion, and my wife. So the closest family, and then my friends. And just like you can see it with the time I spend, like I do have friends, I spend time with them, but like if you compared my pie chart of time compared to the average person, I definitely think that like I give more space to my family and wife and less to the friends, and I think that's just, yeah, but it's just a personal inclination, I guess.
Dylan, what do you think about that, like that division between where you spend your time and what relationships you put it on and what meaning you derive from each?
I think there is an element, again, going back to the time thing, that there's an element of a zero sum about what you can give to people in terms of time, and there's also like a non-linear reciprocation that you get when you really invest in 10 as opposed to half investing in 100. It's not equal what you get back, because the deeper you go with somebody, it's like, what is it? It's the quantitative difference becomes qualitative, and it becomes a whole different thing. So again, keeping in mind, and again, also I think there's like an element of responsibility that you have. If you're this like, a friend to everyone's a friend to no one, but there's that Nietzsche quote I tweeted the other day is like, the value of a thing sometimes isn't what you attain with it, but what it costs you. So again, it's kind of what you're investing, and also what people can demand of you then. So there's kind of an unspoken agreement, like, if you have 8,000 friends, one of them's in dire need, how much do they really think you're going to turn up or show up? And then if you have 8,000 friends and 4 of them have a skiing accident at the same time, you're one man, so automatically you think you become less of a friend, even hypothetically, than you otherwise would be if you spread yourself very thin.
How would you explain that, Luca, in terms of just relationships, that relationship quantity? I feel like there's either a mathematical or a philosophical underpinning to this, what Dylan just explained so poetically.
No, yeah, I think that Dylan hit the nail with this trade-off between quality and quantity, and the fact that it doesn't matter how many relationships you have, but if you don't go deep with at least some of them, I believe. And going deep, it's not something that you can do like in a heartbeat. I mean, of course, there are some people who are better at, let's say, making relationships proceed faster, like building trust, simply like spending the time or like being more present. But still, there is very obviously a trade-off, and I think that sometimes this is like it's a bit hard, because in the short term, like it doesn't necessarily feel like it's worth going deeper on a few relationships, but it definitely matters in the long term. And I think you can see it with like people who had very large friend groups, for example, I don't know, in a moment of their life, I don't know, in high school, or maybe at the current company. But what matters is probably also like what you retain when you move to the next stage of your life, or you move to the next job. And I think that that's something that you don't notice until you notice, kind of. And so I think that Dylan hit the nail with this importance of depth in the relationship. Yeah.
Stick on that for one more second. Because there's this other thing that happens when we do something for a while and then we realize it doesn't serve us anymore. And that's a different type of calculus or a different type of question, right? Like at whatever point you stopped pursuing some sport or something else in your own life. What's that?
Well, on this, I think there is a quote I really liked from one of Coelho's books, which is about a jacket. He talks about a shepherd that has a jacket, and he says like, now it's the middle of the day, and my jacket doesn't serve me anymore, but I still thank it for the night that it helped me survive, and I keep it for the night that will come next week, next evening. Of course, I'm not quoting exactly. I don't have Dylan's ability to memorize, but it's like, I think it's important to think about it in relationships. Like there are definitely some relationships that don't serve you anymore, but there are also relationships that it just so happens that you are in a stage in which they don't serve you, but maybe they will serve you again. And yeah, and I think it's something important to remember.
Dylan, how do you think about that? And it's kind of, I think the root of this is almost a quitting strategy, not necessarily quitting to survive and maybe not quitting to thrive, but just how do you think about quitting, just the philosophy of quitting?
Well, I had an idea kind of tying back to that friend thing as well. I think there's kind of, it's like an inverted hourglass or whatever shape that would be, kind of like an oval where when you're a kid, it's all qualia in terms of your friendships. You're not thinking about these kind of things. And then there's a high school mentality when like popularity becomes the currency. And that's necessarily, there's no depth metric about it. It's necessarily quantity of friends and how many people you're on kind of, and it's nice to be known. And then I think that's something that you ought to grow out of. And then you kind of return to the childhood mentality of friendship, which is just pure qualia again, and just who you want to hang out with just because you like them. And again, a lot of people don't grow out of that. And I feel like, even I'm 28, so I kind of at that stage, I'm kind of like, do I need more friends? If they come along, great, but I'm like, I don't need 800 more friends. I'm on my friend kind of naturally. Okay, we haven't talked in a year. That's fine. Okay. I'm not desperately clinging to. Don't have like a list. It's like, oh God, it's 741 today. We just dropped one. So I'm kind of in that phase now. But again, I think a lot of people don't leave that phase. Even networking, I think it's better to kind of just one or two or three big fish that you can rely on. You don't need to know 8,000 people because again, it's by nature shallow. So it's better to have just a few killers in your corner, and then you're set.
I think a lot about this idea of, you find the hubs and the spokes will follow. It's one of those things. Have your friends, know how they sit as hubs inside of the networks they set either in or on, and then just trust the rest of it. You don't have to make friends with all their friends. You don't have to know about all this stuff. You just be like, oh, if I start here, it'll take me wherever I need to go, but I'm going to maintain that relationship with the person that I know is, a great hub in my life. Luca, just think back to actually, I have no idea how old you are. You can dox yourself or not on this one. I'm about to turn 43. And I think a lot about those like high school friends and what Dylan just said. And I think about I have some very real, genuine cases. My wife and I just moved back to the area where we both grew up. And literally I found myself living the same distance in a totally different town. I live the same distance away from one of my very close friends in high school. And we hadn't talked in like 20 years. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in a different town in the same area, living a block and a half away again. And we've become great friends again. Totally accidentally and totally wonderfully. But like, how do you think about, like, there was never a second thought about closing that friendship out? Like, nobody ever returned the book to the library and was like, It was just like, it just drifted away and then it drifted back in. And there's something beautiful about that. Can you relate to that, Luca? Do you have some friends like this?
Yeah, so I'm 36, and I think I'm quite still in contact with my friends from high school. I was the person who was organizing the yearly pizza after we finished for like until COVID. Then we stopped with COVID, and then we didn't restart it. Also because after COVID, people started having kids, so it's a completely different different stage of life. I relate in the idea of like it's not like really intentional how these shaping relationships or these keeping in contact. Like I'm definitely not a person who thinks about it like in a utilitarian way or like what's best. It it just so happens, and I think that it makes a lot of sense, especially for personal relationships on outside of work, because then you think really more like about you thinking like whether you feel meeting this person, like if you really think about it, not from an obligation point of view. I think that it's also part of what it means to become an adult. Like that's part of like taking the decision based on what you feel rather than metrics such as popularity slash what others think I should do and so on.
What do you think about that transition, Dylan? And at 28, you're in a different part of life for understanding this. That transition point of when did the popularity not matter to you in the friend thing? When did you let go of that? How long ago was this? This is not the therapist couch. It's a genuine question.
Which do I owe you? It was never important to me, but it was important around me, so it became important by proxy.
Yeah.
Kind of, when everyone around you is valuing something, you not having it, or you kind of automatically just kind of want it, but it was never coming from somewhere within. It was kind of more of a situational thing. So kind of once I left that environment where it was just the ultimate currency, it kind of, and there's still a little bit of that in college too, but it's kind of slightly more diluted. And then once you leave college, then it kind of disappears. So once it went, I was kind of like, it's probably a sense of relief with that too. I was like, okay, I don't have to think about that anymore. And then you start kind of, depending on what angle you take through life, you kind of start finding more people. There's like fellow prisoners of war who've escaped, and you find other people who also kind of never felt it, but now they don't have to feel it, so now they're kind of like like minds in that sense. So I think you naturally gravitate towards those kind of people. But again, there's also people who they never leaves them. Its claws too tight, and they often take it online. You can kind of see it.
How do you think about the convergence? Stick with me on this one for this, Dylan. The convergence of understanding what you want, what you feel. And I'm thinking about just the work you share and that you do now, where you're thinking about writers, you're thinking about this stuff, which clearly you're very passionate about. How do you think about the convergence for that and how it, I don't know, signals to the other former prisoners of war who go like, oh yeah, I cared about this too. How do you think about that and building kind of a new tribe around what feels right for you?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is that it's reciprocated. So there's this kind of idea where I didn't know there were others like me, particularly. I grew up in rural Ireland, so conversation rarely goes past, United or Guinness. So that was kind of, I'm more than happy in that context. I'm going back to the Christmas, and I'm also looking forward to it. But so this was something that I just did. It was almost like, a closeted reader. Kind of, that's something I don't talk to my friends about, don't talk to anyone about it. I just do it on my own time. So it's kind of a double life type thing. And then just started posting it online. And I had no real idea that there were other people like that. So then I'm kind of, I don't know if people kind of sense my surprise that also they're surprised and I'm surprised, and it's kind of like we're surprising each other. It's like two people scare each other at the same time. So there's an element of that about it, which was, again, and I've been doing it for like well over a year and a half, maybe. Nothing really happened. And then just this year, things started to happen, and I have no idea why. I didn't change anything, so I'm completely divorced from it. It's like I was doing it, nothing happened, I'm doing it, things are happening, I'll keep doing it, things will stop happening again probably. So I'm kind of watching it from the outside, kind of. So it's fun. but I'm not emotionally tied to it at all because this is kind of what I was doing anyway. And then the other stuff just came along randomly.
Luca, how do you think about the emotional separation from something that you feel is the right thing to do? And there's definitely some time horizon, non-optimal matching going on inside of this. How do you think about what Dylan just said?
No, so first I completely relate with what Dylan was saying about like having started of doing something. Like for me, writing books, I started writing them just for me and because I think they're useful. Recently started to get very good traction, but I'm not so invested in the traction itself. I'm much more invested into the process of writing books because that's the part that interests me, or in the ideas behind the book. That's the thing that really passions me. So this totally. I also feel like relating to what Dylan said about growing up in rural parts, like I grew up in a small city, but intellectually it felt very rural in the sense of interests. Like I didn't meet people interested in what I do, kind of, or in what I care, and I still don't. Like all my clients, all my readers right now are all outside of here, and like not even my friends have read my books or know what it's about or are interested in those topics, and I don't talk with them. I only talk about with people I either meet when there is a consulting engagement and I take the plane or over Zoom. And so I really relate to this, and I think that that's an important part of like also becoming adult, like going back to it, because before you're adult, you are cast in an environment. Like you do not decide who are your friends. They're basically the people who live in the same zip code. You don't decide what you talk about. You have very little agency. Like you are given a set of cards and the game you're supposed to play. Whereas in adult life, well, you are still given a set of cards, but at least you can decide which game to play and which table to sit at, which I think is super important. And I think that part of the transition to adulthood is this realization that now you can go find the kind of life you want to have, and you don't need necessarily to just focus on performing the best at the environment in which you are casting.
What was the first book? How long, was it Power of Adaptation or World Through a Magnifying Glass?
The Control-heuristic.
Okay. And what year was that one?
2017.
So 2017, we're 2024 having this conversation.
Yeah.
That first book, what's the story of the first book? Like writing it, releasing it? How's it happen?
So very funny, because what happened is that I quit the year before my consulting job in corporate. I moved back to Italy. I decided to do the same job I was doing, but by myself. And I discovered that when you transition to independent, it's very hard to find clients at the beginning, especially because at the time I didn't have a reputation. So I found myself with some time on my hand between an engagement and another. And I had, from all the experience I did in consulting, and it was specifically consulting about changing behavior in a corporate setting, but still about creating habits and so on. And I had developed this understanding of habit formation, and I wanted people to know about it, and so I wrote a book about it. And it's very much a lived book. So I knew that the things I was putting there worked, because that's things that I experienced at work and in my life and so on. But the problem was that year I had an injury. I had an injury at my wrist, and I couldn't type. So I dictated the book using speech recognition software, which in 2017 was horrible, and my accent, which is not natively American accent on which those apps are trained, it was a disaster. And so that book came out, great content, terribly written. It sold nothing. I think it sold 14 copies in 3 months, in the first 3 months, Also because I didn't have relationships, it was self-published. Um, well, long story short, I then rewrote it a few years later when my English got better, my wrist got better, and so the book, which is the control heuristic now, has been fully rewritten, same content but differently written. Now it got quite popular. That's the book that started getting me invited at conferences and so on. So yeah, that's the story. That's basically the story of an idea which I got from life. I knew it worked and then had absolutely no idea how to write it. And then circumstances of life made it write it even worse.
Did you know that about Luca, Dylan? Did you know that
No.
story?
No, that's fascinating. And what gave you the goal to think that you could write a book just from scratch? Did it begin as something just for yourself, or did you always have an kind of intent of, no, this could break out?
So the thing is that I feel like I have two impulses in life. One which is related with my wife and like family and relationships with one wife and so on. And the other one is writing books and getting, I have these ideas which I develop through my work and through conversation with clients and so on. And so I know that they can help people because I'm having this conversation one-on-one, and I see the power, and it's just in me, and it's like boiling water that produces steam, and the steam needs to go out, otherwise the pot will explode. And I really feel this impulse. And if I don't write for 2 or 3 days because maybe I have a consulting engagement or something like that, I really feel unsettled. And the following day I wake up at 5 a.m. and I go to the coffee downstairs and I just spend a few hours writing because I feel this primal impulse. Yeah.
And your wife helps nudge you, like other people around you. Do they? No, they're like, just go right, just get out of the way.
Absolutely
No?
not. No. Like this is just my thing. Like I repeat, like apart from my wife, I don't think that other people in my personal life know about my books. Like they kind of have an idea that I write, but it's something extremely nebulous, and it's just my impulse. Like, yeah.
Dylan, what do you think about like where you are now in this literary journey? And I'm less asking about your own writing because I know it's coming eventually, so I know it's going to happen. And that's not to throw any pressure on that. But I mean, Luca, am I doing the math right? You were 29 with book 1-ish?
Yeah, probably.
Uh-oh, Dylan. I don't know about that.
Well, I did say I would start a book before I'm 30, and I'm 29 in 3 weeks. So TikTok.
And you know what the data says? All the crises happen in the years ending in 9, not the ones ending in 0. You're familiar with this?
I never thought about that, but it makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah. I was freaking out when I turned 39 and I was like, what is going on in my life? And then I found there's this whole body of literature that's like, oh, it's the ones ending in 9s, not the ones ending in round numbers. That's when you freak out. So how are you thinking about it? Because you're not just dealing with the soon to be boiling water. You've got the pots on the stove. You put a little salt in it. You haven't seen the surface bubbles yet, or at least not outwardly that you need to admit to. But you're helping other people, right? You're around all these other people creating stuff and editing it. How do you think about that boiling pot and helping them get it out there?
Well, it's a whole lot of fun, first of all. And I kind of feel that I'm going through an apprenticeship because I'm editing full time. So again, what is that quote about, literature is like seeing your own thoughts in their alienated majesty or whatever. So, but when you're in your own writing, I think it's almost can be difficult to really pull apart the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of it because you're kind of so wrapped up in it emotionally and psychologically. So now I'm kind of divorced from that. So I'm really working from the outside in. So I'm learning so much just about how sentences are put together. So in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, this is all great stuff. Now, my problem is that you could do this for 10 years and I'm still training. Like, 40 years go by. But right now, I've kind of just started last year, so I feel like and I'm working on fiction, which I'd never thought about, never thought I could write, never thought I would edit. Um, and just the learning curve on that is insane because it's an entirely different beast to nonfiction.
Why do you think that is? And I guess why specifically for you? Why did fiction feel way over there?
For me, it boils down to there's an optionality in fiction where in nonfiction, if you have a clear idea in your head, there's probably like maybe it's like 5 or 6 ways that you could really say it eloquently and simply. Because there's a brevity impulse that you have to make things clear. And you're kind of centered around this idea. And there's kind of more of a logical train from line to line and paragraph to paragraph. But it's with fiction, it's just the sheer optionality of it. At every juncture, there are 10,000 directions that you go, like, character, description, theme, plot, and then within all of those, there's thousands of like details you could it's like, who was it? Was it not Balzac? Proust. Talk about a Madeleine for 7 books. You could like you could do all these things. There's no right way or wrong way. So that can be dizzying. Because you really have to be bold with your choice because there is no right choice. So you kind of have to go with something and stick to it, and try not to think about, oh, if I took 2 steps back, I could go 1,000 directions in this opposite direction. So there's a sense of there's a boldness that you kind of have to go with it, and you kind of have to lean in and trust your subconscious a lot more. You can't overthink it, which is it's kind of a leap of faith. Even editing, I feel that's like, oh well, we can go here or there. It's like, well, no, what? Just go with the feeling as opposed to trying to hyper rationalize it.
How's it feel to be an apprentice to boldness in that way?
Well, it's inspiring. You also, there's there's this fallacy where we see books when they're published and we don't see the 1,000-fold iterations that got to that point. So we imagine them as kind of this immaculately conceived, and they play into this myth. I think Josh Brolin was talking about this the other day. It was like, Kerouac said, I don't need to edit. It was dictated by God or whatever. But then apparently he edited on the road for like 7 years or something. But so it's a mystique that's played into, which is kind of debilitating when you on the outside and you think I could never do that. But he could never do that the first time either. They were maybe as far away. You may be closer than they were at draft 1 in terms of talent. But you just don't see that. So kind of this is seeing behind the scenes, is seeing how many iterations sometimes things take. It's uplifting. And like Marquez talked about that. He said it's carpentry. You're just taking things apart and putting them together. They look magically. Again, I guess the chair didn't arrive as a chair, just arrived as a bunch of pieces, and then you gotta study how to do your joints and carvings for a long period of time, and it doesn't happen overnight. And it's much more of a physical thing than it is magic.
What do you think about that, Luca? As somebody who now has authored multiple books, including totally rehauling one in the early stage.
I completely agree with Dylan that fiction is a completely different thing. I definitely I don't think I'm anywhere closer to be able to write anything fiction, just because one is the optionality, one is it's just like a completely different way of thinking. Like, it's not just learning a new language, but when you learn a new language, you're still thinking the same way and you're just translating. It's like a completely different activity, different goal, different... Personally, I have some trouble with that. Like, one thing that you would probably notice in my books is the relative absence of stories. Like, the one about my cousin is one of the exceptions. I've often tried to justify why, I'm doing it like to keep the focus on the principle, because often we take the wrong lessons from stories. But the reality is that I still didn't wrap my head against how to compellingly also write stories. And this is something that I'm trying to get better at the upcoming book that I'm working on. Like, even though it's nonfiction, to try to keep a narrative, even if like there is no characters, like try to keep a narrative, to drive some tension in the readers. And that's something that I'm trying to be deliberate, but oh gosh, it's like so natural and so much work. Yeah.
And yet, and this is a compliment, the thing that I appreciate, so actually, personally, I do appreciate the lack of narrative story in your approach to subject matter. I love the way that you will basically introduce an idea, and usually it's a chapter or a subject heading, like for a section, and then you attack it from like 18 different angles. Like you attack it with an academic rigor in a way that, you know, in some ways it reminds me, and, you know, one of the other books I have beside me over here is this book. You know this one, I think, Dylan, you're familiar with this one. Now, more stories in that one, but there's an academic rigor in the way you approach these things where, and Dylan, put your editor hat on this one with me for a second. Do you not need the story if you're like attacking these pieces of logic, and you're not doing it in a boring mathematical, overly calculated way? It's like this nuanced exploration over and over and over again. I personally love consuming that. What do you think about that, Dylan?
Well, I think you generally good story can overcompensate for a lack of style, and a great style can carry you even without a story. Like Hofstadter doesn't use that many stories, but it's just his language is so electric that you're carried along anyway. And Wilson is the same. There isn't like, it's more like fractured anecdotes every now and again, but he really does go into ideas themselves. And I think this, like looking at the publishing world writ large, so many nonfiction books. It's like that. The editor of Harper's, like, 400 books could have been 40 essays, and 4 of those essays should have been published in the first place. And it's like anecdote stuffing, where they have one kind of good idea ish, and then they just kind of tell 9 stories about it, and that's chapter 1, and then they rinse and repeat for the rest of the book, and you were like this. By reading the chapter titles, you almost come away with as much as you had, except for a few relatively well-told anecdotes, but nothing that you're going to be remembering in 2 years' time. So I think that then Luca's work, I haven't read it yet, but now I plan to, is like, it seems like it's a divergence for that, and it's more of an intellectual pursuit, which I think is refreshing now. It's probably more the norm before this current mode took over. But a book like Luca's would be the book that I'd angle towards, where I feel like I'm not being taken for a ride, and you're just trying to word count your way to the end of this chapter, and you're not really idea focused.
You can see the word counting when it's happening. So, Luca, as you're trying to interject more story into this work, into this, I'm going to label it nonfiction because it's definitely not fiction. But it's also, and actually, first question, are you a Hofstadter fan? Have you read much Hofstadter? Is this on your radar at all?
Not yet. But now you pick up my interest.
I mean, he's quoted Hofstadter like 8 times so far, I think, which is a good running count for Hofstadter tallies. I think the only more common theme on this podcast is basically Norm Macdonald references. As you're trying to put story in, what's the part that you're struggling with? And I'm really interested on Dylan's perspective on what's the wrestle that you're having with, you feel like you should have more stories.
Yeah, so first I just wanted to say one thing. When you mentioned the academic, like personally I try to avoid being as academic as possible, in the sense of academic, in the sense of abstract. And I try to be extremely concrete, and like I think that like the number one thing objective that I give myself is to be like useful, concrete, and synthetic. For me, based on that, the reason why I struggle with stories, I think, is that unless you have a very good story, which is extremely relevant, it's going to move me away from those objectives. Like, it's either going to repeat something unnecessarily, or even worse, it might give the wrong lesson to the reader. and so on. So I'm not writing stories. For example, every now and then there are stories, but it's never like, oh, I have a piece of text and now I need to put a story. Because if I do it in this order, usually then you get a story which is not really great. Or maybe it's great from a point of view of like keeping the reader engaged, but it's not something that then actually helps the reader. And yeah, so I think that I have this high standard. And then the other thing is, because I always think that the kind of reader that I'm writing about, I tend to always superpose it to the people that I interact with on Twitter or in real life or in my consulting, which they tend to be like people very interested about the practical takeaways, so on. And myself, I'm like that. But I think that like, yeah, I'm trying to find the middle way. Like, I don't want to go for any story, but I think that I could benefit from finding a few more key stories or something like that. Or like what I'm doing right now, which is not in this new book, I'm not putting any single story in it, apart from the prologue, but I'm trying to drive some narrative. Like, so this focus of like driving a narrative, creating some tension, asking questions, and so on.
What do you think about that, Dylan? What would you say to him as he's trying to figure this out with your editor hat on?
Yes, please, some ideas, some advice.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of conflate story and narrative a little bit sometimes. So there's cute anecdotes that are kind of stories from my life, and they're often fluffer. But what I found kind of working in nonfiction and fiction now is that there are principles of storytelling that you can apply to books writ large. It's almost like a fractal logic. So they apply to chapters, they apply to paragraphs. It's like, strong beginning. You have some leeway in the middle, and you kind of finish, maybe you come full circle. So like the Godfather does, so this kind of storytelling principles that you can, and that applies to, paragraphs, applies to chapters, applies to the book writ large. There's a great book on storytelling. I haven't read it, but I've read excerpts from it, that he says basically all literature and good storytelling is secrets. So it's the slow revelation, withholding, and perhaps foreshadowing of secrets. So it's always kind of just giving the reader a little bit less than they want, and that kind of instills a little bit of curious frustration in them, where they're trying to figure out, they're trying to fill in the gaps. And I think that automatically just kind of ignites the imagination just when you tell them a little bit less than they need. And it's a hook. It's like the definition. It's what a cliffhanger is. You're like, fuck you. I want to know what happened, and now you're keeping it running. But you can do that in a micro level, where it'd be like, you might introduce a strange word and not explain it for a couple of lines. Or you might introduce an anecdote and then kind of go on a divergent path and then come back to it. Just so now they're like, well, what happened to that? And then they kind of get a sense of, okay, here we are. And now they're excited to read on, because you've just given their curiosity a chance to kind of stir. So yeah, even in terms of structure and all these different types of things, I found that the boundary between nonfiction and fiction in terms of techniques that you can play around with is quite porous. And you can do it like, if you ever read John McPhee, he just wrote a book about oranges. It's gripping. And he did one about tennis as well, and he did one about a forest.
The canoes one is the one that canoes or trees.
I haven't read that one. Yeah, I haven't read a bunch of those, but I've just kind of leafed through.
Wreck me. Why did you do this and make this so good, you bastard, you?
Yeah, but it's like it's raw narrative, even though there's nothing fictional about it. You know what I mean? So by reading people like that, you can kind of see what they're doing, and you kind of got to study them a little, and you look under the hood. He's like, how did you do that? But yeah, there's common principles. Yeah.
Luca, what do you think about that? Any follow-up questions for that thought from Dylan?
No, I think it's fantastic, and like I think that Dylan really nailed it when he said like doesn't around the lines of doesn't have to be a story, but there are the principles of storytelling that you can apply to nonfiction. And I think that that's exactly what I was trying to explain and failed of what I'm trying to do now. And I'm so thankful for the examples that you mentioned. I will definitely go and read them and see what I can get from it. So thank you.
Well, if there's one way to trigger an existential crisis, it's to go start revisiting some of these works, anything in the Dylan library. I've got a whole mess of notes here. I'm going to invite you to interrupt me as I just read back through some of these because, man, I'm very happy I brought the two of you together. You've given me a bunch of stuff to stew on, especially as I'm plotting out some stuff for next year, especially as Dylan's plotting out his existential crisis, especially as Luca's plotting out his next book. Back in the beginning, and Luca, just this idea, performance is subordinate to survival. I mean, tattoo it on my eyelids, put it on the wall, something. This idea of just to be, and Dylan, this came from you, to be just out of your comfort zone without drowning. To constantly seek enough discomfort to say, I don't think I'm going to die. I might, but probably not. I think I'm swimming to get healthier and it's okay. Love that expression. Luca, you mentioned understanding the internal in response to the external and vice versa. This was you unpacking, existentialism in this. Dylan, did I get that right? Kind of like this waffling back and forth between internal and external, which reminds me also of your experience of average versus what the average actually is.
Yeah. It's a very interesting, I think there's Joyce had a quote once where people were like, aren't you worried if you just write about Dublin, that it'll alienate, readers from around the world? It's a very small city. Ireland was nothing back then on the global stage. And he says, well, no, if I can truly write about Dublin, I'll be writing about cities everywhere. So it's like this idea of a universal being, you going through the particular to see a universal. And I think that ties into existentialism, when you're going through the self to kind of ask questions that are far bigger than you. But that's the kind of doorway that you have to go down.
Yeah, that's the part of life that's universal. That's the part we actually chase. I love the idea of if you really write about Dublin right, somebody in rural Italy is going to go, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Luca, I owe you a thank you for saying you prefer oblivious to stupid. You bailed me out there. You took my foot out of my mouth. I appreciate it. You also said, and I love the way you.
It was actually Dylan who said that first. I did, yeah.
I saw Matt thinking it, so
you saw me thinking it. Yeah, it's okay. There's this expression I'm going to attribute it to the obscure artist Aesop Rock, and he was like, just the rule is basically don't shoot yourself in the foot when your foot is in your mouth. So long as you don't do that, you're okay. This idea of, and Luca was in a story you told about every week choosing to do a few things where if you're dead next month or if you're dead till 100. And I want to make sure I got this right. So you actually said not optimal, but compatible. Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Once a week, do you review this, or what was the cadence you said?
I don't review, and I don't think that it's something that you need to have a structure. But like many things, I think that it's just that every now and then you just think back about the past weeks, and then you ask yourself, if I keep living this way, will I be satisfied with the results? I think that that's important. And then, of course, you ask this question, will I be satisfied if I keep living this way and I die next month? And will I be satisfied if I keep living this way with the results if I die in 100 years? Yeah.
Dylan, you were talking about at one point the realizing you didn't want it, but everyone else did. This was a high school thing, and so you cared. And I want to just say, maybe before your time, are you familiar with the sneaker, the Reebok Pump? Have you seen this sneaker?
No.
Luca, do you know Reebok pumps that may not have made it to your corner of the world in the late 80s, early 90s? The Reebok pumps were it was a basketball shoe. And this is in the era of like the original Jordans are new and all that stuff is happening. And the Reebok pump, it had in the tongue of the high top sneaker literally in like an air pocket that connected to the sole. And so you'd be playing basketball and you'd be like, oh, I got to pump up because I don't have enough spring in my step or jump or whatever else. So you'd bend over and you'd squeeze the tongue of the sneaker and it would go pss, 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 and you could feel the little balloon inflating in the heel. Now, incredibly stupid, lasted year, 2 years or something else. Everybody wanted them. My parents said no. Like, your Chuck Taylors, good enough, definitely cheap enough. You don't need a pair of these Reebok pumps. And I remember just looking at the other kids who had these and thinking like they were the coolest thing in the world. And I think all the time about how that was the stupidest thing in the world. It had no sport utility. It barely had any fashion utility. And within a couple of years, it was such a joke that like if somebody else was wearing them, you could reach over and there was a release valve so you could deflate their shoe. Or, you know, like somebody would get them and somebody would stab a pencil through the side because kids are horrible. But I think, and as you said it, like you actually have to learn that you don't care. You have to do what Luca said about not being invested in the traction gained, but being interested in writing and kind of like finding that traction of your ideas. I don't think you go through that unless you have like some Reebok pump experiences in your life. Luca, do you think that's true? Do you have to have some stuff where you can look back and be like, wow, that was just objectively stupid. And I'm really relieved not to care.
Yeah, I actually think about a lot about this. Like, I think that I got like immunized to like a certain type of career simply because of my first like 3 years of consulting, where in a corporation where I got to experience like most of the perks, let's say, of a certain type of career. And then I was like, cool, I experienced it and didn't feel much. And so I knew that it wasn't something that I wanted to spend the rest of my life chasing, I guess. And yeah, so I think that there are experiences like these where you need to go through experiences something to realize that maybe didn't matter to you as much as you thought it did.
Dylan, did you have an equivalent, either fashion or music choice or anything else to the Reebok pump that you look back on and you think, that was so colossally stupid, but I was so sucked in at the moment?
There was a lot of, because I kind of came up just when social media was, so I think when Facebook came out, I was 12 or something like that. So we just were kind of, we had a normal childhood, and then our adolescence just became that. So it's definitely no. We had a platform called Bebo, and you got allocated 3 hearts that you could gift each day. And there was
brilliant scarcity. That is
yeah,
phenomenally painful to think about. You at 13 with 3 hearts to give. Oh my God.
And they also had so you had all your friends, but they had a top friends kind of leaderboard where you ranked your friends. Okay.
The original streaks. Like, amazing.
Yeah. So then you're like, well, you know, he's 3 in mine, but I'm 5 in his, so I'm putting that. So you're doing all this, like, there's little, you know, mental games that you're playing, and it's just so futile and stupid. And you think it's, you know, when something changes, you think it's the biggest thing in the world. And then I can't even remember all the times that I thought that around that age, where you think, you know, the world's ending. So yeah, loads of stupid stuff. There's definitely some clothes stuff too, types of pants and things like that.
We all have them. It's a fact.
The fact that I can't even remember is like, I know they were there, but I can't even remember them. So that just kind of says it all, really. Yeah.
And I think, and this is where I want to land this conversation, because I think this comes back again to the principles of storytelling as you started to explain it. And that idea about how like a book, the way the book is shaped can match the way the chapter is shaped, can match the way the paragraph is shaped, can match the way the sentence is structured. This fractal nature of this whole thing. And it ties me back to how Luca explained it in that statement of basically like understanding what's maybe optimal is not always the way that you want to go through. You got to pull together what's good enough at those multiple levels, and then just say, I'm not going to make any one thing that's perfect at any of these levels, but I'm going to do something that rhymes across all of these. Because I think the best works of fiction and the best works of nonfiction, they figure out how to do that. There's this like rhyming fractal essence that you just feel pull you through the entire stories, and those secrets that reveal themselves to us over time. And pulling that together in our relationships, in our work, in our life, that not optimal but compatible part, it's going to be okay. Just do your best. Be kind. It's going to be okay, but keep looking for the not optimal but compatible through lines that you want to just keep on pulling. It's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. Luca Dellanna, if people want to find more, if they want to read your books, where should they find you on the internet?
Well, my books are on Amazon and on most booksellers, Barnes and Nobles, etc. And my website is luca-dellanna.com, luca-dellanna.com.
I really appreciate the use of double in that explanation. I just want to say thank you for doing that. That was awesome. Dylan, what about you? People need more existential dread in their life. People need a professional editor. Where can they find you these days?
So just Twitter. Everything is the fulcrum, the nexus through which everything pours. So Delano A4 on Twitter. And and all editing is taking place at Infinite Books, which is a publishing arm of O'Shaughnessy Ventures. So if you're a writer listening, send us an email and contact me through Twitter.
Fantastic. I want to thank you both so much for coming out and doing this. You're watching Just Press Record, like, subscribe, comment, all the things below, and we are out. Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below to Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Zeigler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.